those players. In the bottom box, is the media being fair in the coverage of Barack Obama and John McCain? You'll be very surprised to hear what the panel has to say.
So glad you asked that. We're going to talk about that right now. The media coverage of the presidential race hasn't so much, according to this study that we're going to talk about, cast Obama in a favorable light as it has shown McCain in a more negative one. That is according to a new study that is out from the Project for Excellence in Journalism. It took a look at more than 800 campaign stories from 43 different media outlets out there, and here's what they found. It shows that McCain's coverage has been 57% negative, 28% neutral, and 14% positive. Here's Barack Obama's coverage: 36% positive, 35% neutral, and 29% negative. Let's bring in today's panelists on this. Bill Sammon is Fox's Washington Deputy Managing Editor. Kiki McClain is a former senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's campaign, and Todd Bollinger is a Republican campaign consultant. Welcome. Good to have all of you with us. And do we have that Gallup poll so we can kind of just pull that up to keep everything sort of fresh in the data as well? We're seeing some more tightening, folks, so this is why I just wanted to bring this up for you. 50% for Barack Obama, 43% John McCain. There's a 7% gap. It was as high as 11% a couple of days ago. And if you go to the likely voter one, which I'll just tell you is 1% closer than that, that's a 6% spread. So let's talk a little bit about this. Kiki McClain, what do you take away from those graphs that we just showed and the way that the negative and positive coverage has been presented for these two candidates?
Well, what you have to really understand, though, is it a chicken or an egg first, right? Does one drive the other? And does negative mean unfair? Not necessarily. There are plenty of candidates in all kinds of campaigns who elicit coverage of negative behavior or negative actions on their campaign, so therefore the coverage is negative. There are lots of stories that talk about very positive events, but that doesn't mean that the coverage was overly nice to them. Yeah. And so I think that's part of it. And some of the experts who dealt with that story, I think Tom Rosenstiel also said, you can't use that study as a determinant of whether or not it drives the outcome of an election one way or the other.
Right. And Bill Sammon, a lot of times what we've seen, and when you look at the coverage of the economic crisis, John McCain got a lot of negative coverage on the economic crisis, and some of it was tied to his coming back to Washington and sort of what many saw as a not great and follow-through attempt to sort of salvage the situation. So is it which came first?
Let me be clear. The media is biased. I have spent a lifetime in the media. I spent 10 years as a White House correspondent, surrounded by my friends from other major news organizations. They're liberals. They just are. And I'll give you an example of one of the media bias of this campaign. You showed some polls up there that are sort of all over the map. The narrative coming out of the mainstream media is that it's all over. It's a landslide. You're hearing the word landslide thrown around over and over and over. That is not just being biased. That actually is being devious because it actually has a deflating effect on Republicans who are sitting here for weeks in the run-up to the election saying, why bother? Why should I go bother vote? So, I mean, it's a bias that is insidious, both in the present and in the future. And, you've seen it example after example, study after study. There was an MSNBC reporter covering the Obama campaign who said it was hard to remain objective. You've got anchor men talking about thrills up their legs. I mean, this is so over the top, it's not even a close call.
Todd Bollinger, what's your take on all this?
The only time the national media was fair to John McCain is when they thought he was going to lose the Republican primary. Just take a look at the New York Times. They did a gigantic expose on him potentially cheating on his wife with a lobbyist. It turned out to be completely false, but I didn't hear anyone hemming and hawing about that. I think, look, the national media is biased. There's no secret there. But look, don't start shorting John McCain's stock yet. The polls are tightening. Polls are telling us that there are twice as many undecideds as there were in 2004, and that's John McCain's wheelhouse, and that's where he's focusing right now, actually in Florida.
Martha, I have something to, it's interesting. I think Bill and I agree on something, and this is the concept of how news, or what's particularly in broadcast, television and radio, can really drive what happens. So the whole debate around exit polls on election days, and the whole issue of whether or not television networks should not report those because we have different time zones in America. And in fact, I think Fox, even in the primaries, everybody inches right up to the line of did they let him out or do they just let a little bit of detail out about certain demographics. And I hope Fox and every other network does not report exit polls on Election Day before all the polls are closed, because it is an inappropriate influence on voters through the rest of the country. You can get to a place, and we've all experienced it, both for conservatives and liberals and moderates as well, where there are events and there becomes what's known as a feeding frenzy, right, where media coverage can then drive certain outcomes to the next day. I think there are good examples and bad examples on both sides, but I do think Bill raises an interesting point, which is where is the coverage that begins to drive an influence as opposed to report? And I think we should be watching in the next 2 weeks. This race is not over. It will definitely tighten. Barack Obama's going to have to earn it, as is John McCain. Right. And you're looking at somebody who stood on election night in Nashville, Tennessee with Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. I know what that feels like to think it's done and it's not. So I agree with Bill and with Todd on that.
Good point. 13 days is many, many news cycles as you break it down day by day. So we still have a lot of reporting to do and a lot to be fair about in this election. Let's take a look at the tone of Sarah Palin's coverage that was found in this study. 39% negative, 33% mixed, 28% positive. Bill, back to you for a moment. What do you think is the best we can hope for? I mean, all journalists strive to be fair, and as you have pointed out, in your opinion and from what you've seen over the course of your, very established career, you feel that they are not fair. So, what do these numbers show us about the 43% out there that are neutral? How hard are people trying, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Well, let me give you another example. Remember when Joe Biden, the vice presidential nominee on the Democratic side, said Barack Obama wants to talk about a three-letter word, jobs, J-O-B-S. Now, that's a silly gaffe, and we all laugh, but just imagine if Sarah Palin had made that precise gaffe. This would have been potato all over again, a la Dan Quayle. She would have been savaged. And I think, sometimes we talk about media bias as an act of commission, but a lot of times it's an act of omission. In other words, they don't do many stories on Biden's gaffes, and they focus instead. This Pew study showed that Biden is basically the invisible man because he doesn't get hardly any coverage compared to Sarah Palin, and yet he's making a gaffe a day, and he gets almost no coverage. So it is, and the other thing about Sarah Palin is that, the media are sort of, they kind of like John McCain, but they disagree with him politically, so that's why they're against him. With Sarah Palin, they viscerally don't like it. It's almost like the Bush derangement syndrome. They just do not like this woman.
And you brought up Dan Quayle, and we probably haven't seen the kind of visceral reaction to a candidate that we've seen from the press and Sarah Palin, unless you go back as far as Dan Quayle. Let's go to Tracy. Thank you very much, you guys. Bill Salmon and Kiki McLean and Todd Bollinger. Thanks. We'll talk to some of you a little bit later. Tracy, we have some